我们墨本教会的弟兄姐妹，大家早安。
And good morning to all our brothers and sisters here in Melbourne, True Jesus Church.
今天整天想用一个主题哈，就是一个都市两个故事，跟大家做个分享啊。
And so today I would like to use the topic, Two Tales, One City, for our mutual edification and sharing.
世界上有很多的都市
There are many cities in this world.
那有些都市老的都市，它存在到现在那就成为大家去考古的一个很好的一个目标嘛。
And there are some cities, ancient cities, in which a lot of people like to go and visit today.
那很多都市是它过了段期间就消失了，然后有新的都市出现。
But there are also some cities that exist for a period of time, but then later on it disappears.
那这种的现象，其实在全世界到处都有，其实也没什么稀罕啊。
And such kind of phenomena is actually quite common, and you can see it happening throughout the whole world.
有一个都市叫做尼尼微哈。
And there is a city by the name of Nineveh.
那这个都市其实已经消失蛮久。
In fact, this city has disappeared for a very long time.
当然，现在很多考古学家都喜欢到这边去考古，因为里面有很多的古文明啊。
And of course, today there are a lot of archaeologists who likes to look for the ruins of this city, to look for any kind of artifacts.
但是因为在圣经当中有2本书，它的主题都跟尼尼微有关系。
And in the Bible, there are 2 books that has a theme that concerns this city of Nineveh.
那很奇妙是说，这2本书的主题居然都不一样啊。
However, what is marvelous about this is that in these 2 books, their main themes are quite different.
第一本书就是大家最熟悉的这个约拿书啊。
And the first book is a book that we're all very familiar with, and that is the book of Jonah.
好，这个约拿神就差他去尼尼微传警告。
And we know that God has sent Prophet Jonah to go preach warnings to the people in Nineveh.
那你可以看到这整本书的主题是在讲神的怜悯跟慈爱。
And throughout this whole book, we can see that the theme of this book talks about the grace and mercy, loving kindness of God.
那大概150年之后，另外一本书就是拿红书啊。
However, 150 years later, another book appears, and that is the book of Nahum.
他是在预言这个尼尼微它的毁灭跟它的灭亡啊。
And this book prophesies regarding the destruction of the city of Nineveh.
所以看到的是神的公义跟审判。
And from this book, we can see the justice and righteousness of God.
那你会发现，同一个都市，它在约拿书的上看到是神的怜悯，但是同一个都市在拿红书看到却是神的审判。
And the same city, the city of Nineveh, from the book of Jonah, we can see the loving kindness of God. However, in the book of Nahum, we see the justice and righteousness of God.
那如果我们把这个尼尼微这个城，把它浓缩到一个人的一生当中，
And if we were to perceive this city of Nineveh as likened to a person's whole life's journey,
有可能我们的生命到最后是面对是神的怜悯，也有可能最后面对是随着神的审判这样。
it is possible that a person's life, at the very end, they would face either the love and mercy of God, or they would face the justice and righteousness of God.
那所以今天整天跟大家透过这2本书来去思考说，为什么一个都市居然就有2种完全不一样的故事？
And throughout today, our services, we would share and contemplate to think about how is it that one city has 2 kinds of stories, tales behind it.
好，那第一本我们就当然谈到尼尼微，对不起，那个约拿书了哈。
So let us firstly talk about from the book of Jonah.
坦白讲，约拿的故事是从小我们从幼稚班就在听了哈。
And we all know that we have heard the story of Jonah, even from when we are really young.
那我们一般都会把焦点放在约拿身上。
And very often we would put the focus on the prophet Jonah.
你听神的命令，你不听神的命令，那神怎么样用他的大能让他受到阻挡，然后甚至被大鱼吞吃这样子。
And how the prophet refused to listen to the Lord's instruction, And then because of this, he was being punished by God, and eventually he was being swallowed by a big fish.
那后来到了第2章，你看到约拿他在肚腹当中，鱼腹当中怎么样的向神祷告。
And in chapter 2 of the book of Jonah, we can see how the prophet prayed to the Lord from the belly of the fish.
然后到第3章，你看到神第2次在呼召约拿，约拿这次就乖乖的到尼尼微去传警告。
And in chapter 3, we can see that God once more sent prophet Jonah to go to preach the warning, and then this time the prophet went submissively.
他也当中看到这个尼尼微他们是怎么样彻底的悔改。
And in this chapter, we can also see how the people of Nineveh, they repented.
那第4章你看到这个约拿非常非常不服气，说神为什么要怜悯这个尼尼微这样。
In chapter 4, we can see how prophet Jonah was extremely displeased, and he complained and questioned God that why did God do this?
一般我们在谈到约拿书的时候，应该要再讲更深入的一点事情了。
So when we study the book of Jonah, we need to study it and then think deeper from a deeper perspective.
有时候你会觉得说，为什么约拿他不愿意到尼尼微去传警告？
Sometimes we may wonder and ask ourselves, why did prophet Jonah refuse to go and preach warning to this city?
好啦，那结果他后来还是乖乖的去了。
Even though we know eventually he went to do this work.
他一句话让这么多人，整个城的人在悔改，然后回心转意。如果是你是我，哇，我们都高兴都来不及了哈。
And we know that by his mere one phrase of what he said to the people, the whole city, the people started to repent.
那为什么这个先知居然会很生气
Then why is it that this prophet was angry of what has happened?
我如果今天是我传这样子走阿德雷的1个月，让1000人来信主，我都兴奋的都睡不着觉啊。
And if I was in his shoe, say for example, I preached around Adelaide and there were 1,000 people who came to believe, I would have been very happy about it.
我怎么可能在神面前还生气？你为什么让这1000人来信主呢？怎么可能啊？
And how could I have become angry before the Lord and complain against God?
但是约拿就真的是这样子啊。
However, this was what actually happened to prophet Jonah.
好，我们请看一下这个列王记下
Let us turn to 2 Kings
第14章
chapter 14.
这边有大概很简单的介绍约拿的事迹。好，
And in this chapter, it introduces very briefly regarding prophet Jonah.
那时间点是在这个耶罗波安2世的时候。
And the time frame during this time was
那耶罗波安是所北朝当中做王最久的一个王。
during the time of Rehoboam, and he was the longest reigning king.
那也是在北朝以色列当中最强盛的一个时期。
And he reigned during the time where the northern kingdom was the strongest.
所以第25节谈到说他的国土也扩展得非常的大。
In verse 25 here it recorded how he was able to expand the territory of Israel.
就没想到这个耶罗波安2世他的土地的扩展居然跟神的救恩有关系。
And then from here we can also see the expansion of the kingdom of Jeroboam. It actually has a lot to do with God's plan as well.
这个是约拿讲的。好，这个他等于是这个土地扩张的背后的意义是约拿讲的。
And the expansion of this territory has been mentioned by prophet Jonah himself.
好，我们看一下26节。
Let us read verse 26. 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 26. For the Lord saw that the affliction of Israel was very bitter, and with the bond of free there was no helper for Israel.
27节。
Verse 27. And the Lord did not say that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash.
好，如果你看25节谈到说这个约拿说为什么会这样子，他特别这样讲。
And in verse 25, we can see how the prophet Jonah has spoken what would happen, that is, the territory would be expanded.
就是因为神在过去当中看到以色列百姓被这外族人欺负得非常非常辛苦。
This happened because the Lord has saw the affliction of the Israelites, how in the past they were being oppressed by the Gentile nations.
那甚至连自由都没有了哈。
And they were oppressed to the point that they have lost their freedom.
所以神就透过兴起这个耶罗波安二世，让他们有一个缓和时间，然后一个很怎么样得到释放的时间。神希望借这个机会让他们回转到神面前。
And therefore, God wanted to save his people through the hand of King Jeroboam, so that during his reign, his people might be able to receive their freedom.
所以27节说，神借着耶罗波安来拯救以色列百姓。
That is why verse 27, it recorded that God saved the people by the hand of Jeroboam.
那那个侵略外族当中有最主要两个民族。
And then the nations which oppress Israel, there are mainly two nations.
第一个是以色列的北边，就是亚兰国。
And the first one is a nation that's located in northern part of north part of Israel, which is the nation of Aram.
对，好，然后在更北边就是我们大家很恶名昭彰的这个 notorious 这个亚述国。
And then further north is a nation which we are all familiar, which is the Assyria.
那约拿这个时期等于是亚述最弱的时候。
And during the time of Prophet Jonah, it was a time where the nation of Assyria were not the strongest.
因为他们里面有内战所以说哇，大家为了争夺王位就没有时间管外面的事情。
And because at the time they had a lot of civil wars, and therefore they had no time to worry about the nations that surrounds them.
好，那又有瘟疫，哇，他死了非常多人。
And at the time they also experienced pestilences, and a lot of people lost their lives.
那在这个约拿去传警告之前发生的这个日全食就是那个 total eclipse of sun 那这个对我们现在讲是觉得没什么，对当时来讲是一个很可怕的现象。
And then before Prophet Jonah went to preach his warning, an event actually happened that is the total eclipse of the sun. And for the people at that time, this was an event that was quite fearful and dreadful.
所以你会看到为什么约拿他随便讲一句话，大家都悔改，其实他前面神已经做很多的工作了。
So we can understand why the people of Nineveh immediately repented, because prior to Jonah going into the city preaching the warnings, all of these things have already happened.
所以有些人他假设有一段期间很久没有来教会。
So if we think about this, for example, if a certain person have not been to church for a very long time.
后来感谢神回来了。
But later, thank the Lord, they returned back to church.
那很可能就是前面有发生的很多的故事。
It is very likely that a lot of things has happened prior to them returning.
那这些故事都是神他用他奇妙的慈爱的杖然后把他的所爱的人慢慢打回来这样子。
And all these stories that has happened involves God using his staff of love to discipline and to bring his loved one back.
因为我自己本身就有这样经历了。
Because as for me personally, I've also experienced something very similar.
我也曾经跟大家见证过，在我大概14岁、15岁那2年，我是没有来教会的。
I have previously testified to all of you that when I was 14 or 15 years old, there was a period of time where I did not go to church.
那是为了要准备考那个senior high school 的联考哇，几乎都没有来教会了。
Because at that time I was busy preparing for the examinations to enter into senior high school, and therefore I did not have time to go to church.
你久没有去了，你就不会想去了。
And the longer that you do not attend church services, then you do not want to go as time goes by.
你第一次没有来教会的时候，内心很害怕，哇，神会不会处罚你
And the first time that you did not attend church services, you perhaps would feel fearful in your heart, fearing that God would punish you.
后来发现日子也是一样这样过也是过得很好你就不怕了
But later on, you discovered that your lives is still the same, quite peaceful, and then you think everything is okay.
然后就习惯就没有来了。
And as time goes by, you don't attend church services, it becomes a habit.
然后心里就还想很多的理由啊，就是因为什么原因什么原因，所以我今天不来，合理啊，反正就是这样啊。
And within your heart, you come up with various kinds of excuses to justify yourself for not attending church services.
但是神还是用他慈妙的慈爱的手把我拉回来了哈。
But the Lord still, with His merciful hand, He pulled me back.
或许有些人的经历跟我一样，或许。
Perhaps some of us would experience similar things as what I've had in the past.
或许说也没有什么经历特别是就是一个观念一想通了就回来，也有人这样子的。
Or perhaps there are some people also, they did not have any special kind of things happen to them. Rather, it's just a change of mindset that they decided to return back to church.
好，那我今天在约拿书我就不讲约拿了啦哈。
So today we are not going to focus on Jonah from this book.
好，我们把焦点放在尼尼微身上。
We're going to shift the focus to look at Nineveh, the people in Nineveh.
你可以透过这个约拿书看到神对人的爱是超过利害关系啊。
And from the book of Jonah, we can see that the love that God has for humankind really exceeds all things.
如果你看约拿书第4章，
If we turn to the book of Jonah, chapter 4,
那神在这个过程当中做了一件很奇妙的事情。
and throughout this journey, the Lord has performed something quite miraculous.
因为那时候约拿赌气嘛，然后他在这个尼尼微城外搭了一个帐篷，他说我要看看神要怎么处罚尼尼微，好这样。
And because at the time we know Jonah was extremely angry, and therefore he went out of the city, sat outside there, made himself a shelter, and waited to see what God would do.
就没想到第6节说，神就安排了一颗蓖麻，然后高过它，然后遮阴哈，那他就可以哇很舒服，在那个树荫底下很舒服这样。
And verse 6 it recorded that then God prepared a plant that came up and covered Jonah and became a shade for him, and he was extremely grateful for it.
然后隔一天呢，就神又安排了一个虫子，然后把这个蓖麻树咬死了，就枯干了。哇，太阳晒的，那个又拿这个头昏的，就很生气啊。
But then in verse 7, the next morning, the Lord prepared a worm which damaged the plant so that it withered, and therefore the sun scorched Prophet Jonah.
结果这个约拿生气到说第8节说他要求死啊，他说我死了比活的还好这样。
And in verse 8 recorded how Prophet Jonah again became angry, and he wished death upon himself, saying, "It is better for me to die than to live."
那约拿书的一个很重要的结论，就第10节说，神说这个蓖麻不是你种的啊，又不是你栽培啊，那你一天一夜发生一夜干死，你都爱死嘛哈。
And one of the main conclusions that we can learn from the book of Jonah is in verse 10, when the Lord said to Jonah, "You have had pity on a plant for which you have not labored, nor made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night."
何况是这个尼尼微呢？哇，这个没有办法分别左手右手的，就12万多人。
And in verse 11, God said, "Should I not pity Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 people living in it?"
一般我们讲说不能够分辨左手右手的，一般是指小孩子啦。
And these people are those who cannot discern between right hand on their left. We often refer to this group as the young children.
好，那这个小孩子，如果你这种不能够分辨左手右手，大概是5岁左右吧，可能甚至还要更小。小孩子他22万人，就知道这个人数有多少。
And if we consider them as referring to young children, probably about 5 years old and below, then there are about 120,000 of them. We can imagine how many total number of people living in the city.
那这种我们这样算一算，这个尼尼微至少100万人，就绝对跑不掉了。
And if we were to make a quick calculation, the city of Nineveh would have at least one.
好，那现在这件事什么？神透过这件事告诉约拿，也是告诉我们一件事情。
And then through this event, what the Lord wanted to tell Prophet Jonah, and it's also a message for us all today as well.
约拿为什么不喜欢到尼尼微传警告？是因为这个亚述人之前苦待了以色列人。
Why did Prophet Jonah refuse to go to this city in the first place? It was because the Assyrians has once oppressed the nation of Israel.
换句话说，我们认定的好坏是跟我厉害有关系的。
And in other words, that he has determined whether certain people are good or bad based on what they have done in the past.
好，譬如说我们看到蚊子就说啊，这个蚊子是坏虫，因为它叮我们很痛啊，会痒啊。
For example, if we see a mosquito flying around, we would say that the mosquito is bad because in the past we have been stung by the mosquito.
但是对青蛙来讲，哇，蚊子很好啊，很好吃啊，啪就把它吃掉了，很好吃啊，对不对？
However, if you are a frog and you were to see a mosquito flying around, it is a good thing because it is their source of food.
所以你发现人对爱的看法其实是有条件的，比如说对我好，我就觉得啊，这个我应该对他好；对我不好，就觉得我应该对他不好。
And so we can see that as human beings, when it comes to love, we have certain criteria and requirements. Then, if other people treat us well, then we would treat them well as well.
但是神的爱不是这样。
However, this is different when it comes to the love from God.
坦白讲，这100万的尼尼微城的人全部死掉了，对神来讲也没什么损害。
And if we think about this 10 billion people living in this city of Nineveh, it does not matter much to God.
对，那这100万的人全部悔改来信神，对神来讲没有增加什么。
And even if these people living in this city were to repent and return to God, it's not a major thing in the eyes of God.
所以你发现，但是神表达就是说，我今天爱人跟厉害跟没有所谓厉害的关系。
And what God wanted to demonstrate here that it is no great thing for Him to show His love to humankind.
所以我们坦白讲，我们现在已经信耶稣了，我千万不要想说。我做什么对神有什么帮助？坦白讲是不需要的，神对神来讲是不需要的。
So today, when we believe in the Lord, it is not necessary for us to think that what are things that we can do for the Lord. These are mere trivial things in the eyes of God.
有时候我们想说我们要做什么，要报答主耶稣，对，以利益来讲，其实是台湾也是没 nothing， 根本就没什么价值的。以利益来说。
And then sometimes we may say, what should we do in order to repay God's love in terms of bringing benefit to God? We actually, as a human being, we cannot bring much benefit to God.
但是我们对神所付出的，神记在心里，是不是因为那个利益，而是那种爱的回馈，对神来讲，神的满足神的满足这样。
However, the things that we do for the Lord is not so much the benefit we bring to God. Rather, it's the heart that propels us to do this for the Lord.
这个就好像我们在做我们有些年轻的夫妻你们小孩子，譬如说有3岁4岁的小孩子
And this is just like an example when a young couple, they have young children about 3 to 4 age.
小孩子会画图，我的爸爸，我的妈妈。
And the young children would often draw their drawings of their mother and father.
坦白讲，那个画没有人看的啦，你拿到外面，人家送给人家，人家不要了。
And to be frank, the quality of their drawing is not that great. And even if you were to give it as a gift to others, people wouldn't want it either.
但是在父母眼中很宝贵，还用框子把它框起来。
However, for the parents themselves, they treat this particular drawing as something very precious, and they would even frame it up.
我的大女儿画那幅图我们到现在留下来。那个画那个我是脸是黑色的，脸是黑的。
I remember my oldest daughter when she drew a drawing of me when she was younger. We still keep the drawing up to today. However, if you look at the
那个脚像竹竿一样两只根本那个怎么画也不像我，但是看来是喜欢
The drawing has me with a dark face and also a stick-figured legs. Is not very nice to look at.
所以用这个角度，你就可以想到神的爱，然后也让约拿想说，你今天你之所以这么不能够接受尼尼微，就是因为曾经受到尼尼微的伤害。
And so from this incident, we can see that the love of God that is shown through the people of Nineveh, and that sometimes things happen to us in the past that make us unable to accept other people.
但是对神来讲，所有人类都是伤害他的，也包括犹太人、以色列人， 也包括这些信徒啊。
But from God's perspective, all humankind has once offended God in some way or another.
但是神还是用他的爱来怜悯我们，来拯救我们，这样。
But God still used His love to have mercy on them and to save them.
好，所以因此，我们也回到这约拿书的一个主题了，哈。
So let us now return to one of the main themes of the book of Jonah.
我相信约拿到后来想通了神的想法，才会写下约拿书。
I believe later on Jonah has finally understood from God's perspective why he did this thing. Therefore, he wrote this book of Jonah.
我有时候会把这个约拿书想象好像一个球赛，在比赛那个球赛。
And I often treat this book of Jonah is like a football match.
譬如说，假设我们这个澳洲跟其他国家在比足球，譬如说了哈。
And for example, if Australia was to compete against another nation in soccer, for example.
如果对方的球踢得越好，我们越气啊，越是不同队又很生气，我们为我们澳洲队加油哈。
And if we see that the opposing team were to perform really well in the game, then of course, from our end, we would feel frustrated.
但是如果不是澳洲人在看这场球赛，还是看这个球员踢得怎么样，那个技术怎么样，就很平静的看着这个整个球赛那个球技哈。
But as for the other people, non-Australian people, if they were to view this competition, they are quite neutral in their position. They would comment more on the talents and the abilities of the players.
昨天我们在讲这个保罗的时候，他其实也在学习这件事情。
And yesterday we have mentioned that for Apostle Paul, he also had to learn this particular lesson.
好，我们看一下这个腓立比书的第1章。
If we turn to the book of Philippians, chapter 1.
他到了这个罗马的时候，
When he arrived in the city of Rome,
虽然他在监狱里面，但是他还是依然是继续传福音呐。
and even though he was being put in prison, however, he still continued to preach the gospel.
他甚至为这些在看管他这些士兵，向这些士兵传福音啊。
And he even preached to the soldiers who were being put on guard to look to guard over him.
那保罗这样做呢，就带动当时教会的一个一个这个所谓的宣道的一种气氛啊。
And what Paul did, his spirit and attitude in preaching actually influenced positively the church at the time.
当然，有些人真的就像保罗一样，很真心的传福音，那当然这个是感谢神的地方啊。
And there are some people that truly sincerely preach the gospel, and for this we give thanks to God.
那有些人不是有些人出于嫉妒啊，所以他们就怀疑保罗这个人。你今天为什么被关？不像你讲的，你一定是做什么坏事啊？
However, there are also some who preach the gospel with a different motive, and they question Paul, asking him why he did this thing in certain ways, etc.
所以第17节就这么说了哈。
So in verse 17 here it recorded.
说那些人他传福音是要加增我困锁的苦楚，后面还这句话这么讲。
And Paul also written that these people, they preach the gospel in order to add afflictions to his chains.
就是看起来就是说他们用对保罗一种毁谤啊，或是不要说毁谤，就至少说非善意的看待他，好，然后呢，来让保罗也是觉得很痛苦这样。
And in other words, this group of people actually slandered against Paul and made his life very difficult.
那这个时候怎么办？如果今天，哇，这些人实在是大家就做圣工就做圣工嘛，为什么要彼此伤害呢？你有时候会这样想啊。
So if this were to happen to us today, when we do divine works together, why would certain people have this kind of ulterior motives?
真的就是发生了。
But these things actually do happen in real life.
那有时候你要改变人家想法很难呐。
And it is difficult for us to change the mindset of other people. 有
时候你是用辩解，用这种争吵，或是用这种极端手腕来改变人家想法。坦白讲，刚好事情我们讲说事与愿违啊，就是说你所愿望发生的事情刚好相反这样子。
And it's often useless if we try to change the mindset of people through debating with them or quarreling with them.
啊，那保罗的想法是说，好，我不要再纠缠这事情。他想法说没有关系啊，至少基督的福音传开了，这样哈。
But as for Paul, he has learned that not to put all these things to heart. Rather, he feels that as long as Christ is and the truth is being preached, it's okay.
就好像你在看球赛一样，你原本是为澳洲队加油的，你现在不再为澳洲队加油了。
It's just like when you are watching a soccer match. Initially, you were vying for the Australian team, but now, as the match progresses, it doesn't really matter anymore.
啊，譬如说你已经知道谁赢了嘛，哈，哎，你知道谁赢，再去看了就不会那么生气了哦，你就可以欣赏更多那种真的是欣赏球技啊，哈。
Particularly if you already know what the outcome or who the winner will be of the game, then you just watch the game to enjoy it and not to think about it too much.
所以这个就是保罗方法，他把站在更远地方看，哎，感谢神啊，那反正福音都传开了哈，不要计较这么多了。
And so this was the method being used by Paul, and that he viewed this situation from a different perspective and thought to himself, it doesn't really matter what happens to him as long as Christ is being preached.
就是他站在更高的地方，看到很多正面的东西然后来覆盖那些负面所造成的负面那种伤害。
And he viewed this incident from a higher perspective, and he was able to see there are more positive things that can come out of the situation rather than negative things.
所以神对约拿的教导也是这样子。
And this is similar to the lessons that God wanted Prophet Jonah to learn.
因为这个时候神在跟他讲说，约拿说啊，这个尼尼微啊，这些讲这些已经坦白讲已经约拿听不下去了。
And because the Lord know that even if he tried to explain to him and how the people of Nineveh did this and that, the prophet would not listen.
所以神就用这个蓖麻啊来教导他，提醒他，然后来让他去思想神的爱是什么样子。
And because of this, God prepared a plant, and through this plant, God wanted Jonah to contemplate and think about the love of God.
在这个事件当中，整个最大的关键就是尼尼微城的态度。
And throughout this event, one other important thing is with regards to the attitudes of the Ninevites.
你看第3章这个当约拿传警告的时候，
In chapter 3, when we see how Prophet Jonah preached a warning to the people.
那开始是一般的百姓，他们信服神，然后禁食，然后大家穿那个麻衣，就是好像有死人一样，代表他们难过这样子。
And the Bible recorded that the normal people of Nineveh, they believed, they proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth.
然后到第6节的时候，哇，这个消息传到这个王的耳中，哇，他也是这样做。
And verse 6 recorded, and when this news came to the king of Nineveh, he also arose from his throne and did the same thing as everyone else, to put on sackcloth and sand and ashes.
这王做了这个彻底，不是只有人禁食哦，连动物都要禁食啊！
And not only that the people living in the city needed to fast, but they also included their livestock and animals also had to do the same.
这个如果在21世纪，那个保护动物团体就是出来抗议啦。
And if this were to happen in the 21st century, then those animals activists would have come out and complained about this certain act.
当然在那个时候是属于集权国家啦，王想要这样做什么，大家都要服从。
But of course, during the time of Jonah, the period of time is different. So whatever the king has announced and proclaimed to do, the whole nation must follow.
那王还吩咐一件最关键的一件事情。
And from here, the king also instructed another important thing.
就是第8节说，你们个人要回头离开所行的恶道，丢弃手中的强暴。
And that is recorded in verse 8, and that is, let everyone turn from his evil ways and from the violence that is in his hands.
那第9节另外一个关键就是说，他不是说神一定会怜悯我们，他说或者说用这种方式来祈求神，或许会怜悯我们，也或许不会怜悯我们这样。
And in verse 9, the king continued to say, perhaps who knows if God will turn and relent and turn away from his fierce anger and not punish them.
但是如果你悔改的话，至少神可能会怜悯，但是你如果不悔改，永远就不会得到神怜悯。
And so, if a person at least repent in their ways, there is a chance that God will relent and turn away from His anger.
好，所以第10节也就是整个改变的关键，神看到他们的行动，然后呢就回转不再降祸给他们。
In verse 10, recorded, when God saw their works and they turned from their evil ways, then He relented from the disaster that He said He would bring upon them.
所以整个其实以尼尼微角度来讲，为什么神会改变这么多？最主要是第3章这一段。
And from the whole event in the book of Jonah, why did the Lord relented from putting disaster on the city? It is because what is recorded, chapter 3, the attitudes and the behavior of the people.
有人说神的旨意都不会改变，然后有人说这个时候神怎么改变他的旨意呢？
And some people would ask the question that if the will of God should not change, then how is it that in this situation we can see how God changed His mind?
有些事情就是譬如说神的计划它不改变，这是事实啊。
There are certain things, for example, the plans of God, these things cannot change, and that is the truth.
但是如果这些事情是碰到跟人的选择权有关的时候呢，神不会马上下决定。
However, if a certain incident or event has to do with the choices that is made by the people, then God does not immediately make a conclusion and set on what He must do.
神会先传警告
And God will firstly preach His warning to the people.
传警告的意思就是说，你还有做选择的机会哦。
And by preaching this warning to the people means that God is giving them the chance to make the right choice.
换句话说，神这个时候告诉我们的是说，我的旨意是根据你所选择的结果。
And in other words, God is saying that my will has to do with the choice that you are about to make.
好，我们看一下这个马太福音第17章。
If we turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17.
对不起，22章马太福音第22章。
Matthew chapter 22.
那这个是一个比喻啦，就是这个王要请客嘛。
And this is a parable regarding how a king were to invite his guests.
好，那他邀约这些人说：“我已经准备好了，你们要来参加宴席哦。”
And when things were, the preparations have been made ready, and he sent out his servants asking the guests to come and attend the banquet.
那这些邀请都是他第一次跟他们邀的时候，他们都同意，他们才会准备翻那些分量，然后替他们安排座位。所以22章是属于第2次邀约的这个部分了。
And so this first group of people, which the servants sent out to call, were the group of people that was first invited to this banquet.
所以第4节还会说，你们去告诉那个被招的人，就是第一次已经跟他们邀约的这些人。
That is why in verse 4 it says here that the master said to the servants, "Tell those who are invited."
对，然后呢说，我的宴席准备好了，你们要来参加，这样子哈。
Telling these people, "See, I have prepared the banquet, and everything is made ready. Please come to the wedding."
然后后来当然他们有些就用很多的理由就把他推掉，就不来了。
But later on, we see how there a lot of them in this group. They use a lot of excuses and they refuse to come.
所以这王就好了，就到街上去拉人进来，你来参加哈。
And because of this, the king was furious, and then he sent his servant out to gather those who stood in the highways and to invite them to join in the wedding.
14节这么说哈，说被招的人多，选上人少。还有一个结论是这样。
Verse 14 tells us the conclusion: "For many are called, but few are chosen."
所以我们一般在讲说神的旨意不改变，是说你已经下了那个决定之后呢，神说好吧，那我就根据你的选择来做最后的我们讲所谓的选召的旨意啊。
So when we talk about how the will of God does not change, these are referring to a situation in which we have already made our choices about certain things, and therefore the will of God has been established based on the choice that we've made.
对，换句话说，我们在讲到选召的时候呢，基本上有2个动作。
And In other words, when God calls for his people, in general, it requires two responses from us.
第一个动作是神邀约你，
Firstly is the Lord calls out to the people to invite us.
那第二个动作就是这个人他正面的回应神。
And the second action is that this person who is being called, they respond towards God.
那这整个才叫做拣选。
And this whole process is what we call the process of being called by the Lord.
那第一个神那个邀约那个还不是拣选哦，拣选是要包括人的回应，那个整个才叫拣选。
And then the first invite, the invitation from the Lord is not being chosen yet. Rather, it's just an invite that is being sent out to people.
所以我们就回到刚刚那个约拿书。
And if we were to return to the book of Jonah,
所以你可以看到神的爱跟人的意志其实也是有关系的啦。
and we can see how the love of God and also the choices made by men, the will of man, they're all interconnected.
所以神叫约拿去传警告，意思是说我还给你机会选择，看你要选择回应我，还是选择拒绝我。
So when God sent Prophet Jonah to preach the warning to the Ninevites, it is also the Lord telling them that He's giving them a choice, so they need to make the right choice.
对，当神下定决心的时候，那就已经没办法改变。
And when the Lord has already made His final decision about certain things based on the choices we made, then things cannot be changed.
以约拿书来讲，神下定决心拯救他们了，约拿再怎么吵，神也不会改变他的想法，神也不会改他的决定了。
And so, as for Prophet Jonah, even if he were to continue to be angry and complain because of what has happened with the people of Nineveh, God still would not change his mind.
好，这个是我们比较熟悉的约拿书，所以我今天很简单的再把约拿书的重点跟大家做分享。
And so this is the story about Jonah we are very familiar with. So today I've gone through it very briefly with all of you.
神的爱超乎人的成见。
And that we learn about the love of God exceeds all expectations of man.
神的爱超过人的这个利害的关系。
And that the love of God exceeds our human abilities as well.
那第三个就是神的爱，他的最后的决定是跟人的态度有关系，人对生命选择态度有关系。
And thirdly is that the love of God has a close relations with regards to the choices that we make in life.
好，那下午我们就把焦点就放在这个那鸿书。
This afternoon we will shift our focus to the book of Nahum.
好，那因为那鸿书大家可能比较少读，所以如果你有时间的话，你就用个5分钟啊，在吃饭的时候都要瞄一下哈，看它到底内容在讲什么。
And because the book of Nahum is a book that we don't often read, so if we have time over lunchtime, please, if you can, to read through the book of Nahum.
好，那我们今天上午就聚会到这边。
So this ends our morning service.